Sam Vallen, welcome to Australian Musician.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Greg. Thanks.
We're talking to you because you've got a new solo single, debut solo single called Flicker, which was out about a week ago. Your day job is a guitarist with Caligula's horse. Before we talk about all of that, let's go back and tell me about the main artists that influenced you growing up.
Yeah, I've got a pretty diverse kind of taste in music. I mean, I guess that's what everyone says, right? But when it comes to like the artists that kind of inspired me at each step in my career, I loved the Beatles. I loved ABBA when I was young, Michael Jackson, all of the all of the same kind of stuff that inspired a lot of kind of kids to get into music, I suppose. But my first musical heroes, like the people who I really explicitly borrowed things from and learned things from. Probably Steely Dan. I kind of got into Steely Dan from my father, and the further I dug, the more interesting I found it all. Loved Steve Vai. He was a huge guitar hero of mine, probably my biggest guitar hero. And then I got into a lot of progressive metal stuff. I think Opeth are probably the most lasting influence in that world. You can probably hear a little bit of that in Caligula's Horse. So I mean, that's kind of, I guess three varied influences, but there's many others, of course.
You mentioned Steely Dan, who had the pick of any session guitarist they wanted. Did you get into the guitarists that played on their albums?
Yeah, I absolutely love Larry Carlton. Well, I mean, obviously they had many session guitarists. Larry Carlton was probably if you wanted a de facto Steely Dan guitarist, it's Larry Carlton. And I adore his playing, his arranging. Even a lot of his solo work is fantastic as well. But he's an example of a guitar player that I've kind of explicitly sat down and tried to understand what's going on in his playing, understand what goes through his mind. And I find actually, funnily enough, with a lot of my guitar students, Larry Carlton ends up being this early kind of like exemplar of a lot of the concepts we end up covering, improvisational and so forth. So this is a roundabout way of me saying, no, I absolutely adore Steely Dan's guitar players, and Larry Carlton especially is a huge guitar hero of mine.
Yeah, you've traveled the world playing with Caligula's horse. Have you met any of your music heroes?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we've been fortunate enough to actually like tour with a lot of our, a lot of the people who, if you had told me as an adolescent I would be touring with, I wouldn't believe you. Like, we've toured with Opeth. Played, massive festivals with many of my favorite bands, artists, Devin Townsend, guys like that. I'm just trying to think like who we haven't. Stephen Wilson's someone who I'd love to play with. We never have, but yeah, we've been kind of fortunate enough for the most part to, kind of have our paths cross with a lot of those people.
Yeah.
So you're pretty lucky there.
You completed a PhD on prog rock at the Queensland Conservatorium.
Mm.
What's the starting point for that? I gather it goes further back than Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Yeah, very much so. So my take on that was kind of just to say, there's this interesting period in like the late 1960s, kind of lining up with albums like, Sgt. Pepper's and the year before with Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, where there's this drastic and almost immediate shift in the way artists were describing their own music. It's funny because it actually aligns with the moment that the term rock actually came into the parlance, at least as far as I can see in the research. And essentially what it is, like this phenomenon, is that artists started talking about their music in these very like modernist kind of terms, like we've got to progress, it's got to get better, it's got to improve, we've got to blah blah blah. And of course the term progressive ends up coming out of that, but at that time it wasn't a genre marker. It was this term that almost acted as a kind of meme, like someone said it and someone else took it, and eventually all of the artists were kind of rallying around it. But it's crazy, in that period, like it really only took a year or two before that was kind of the thing that a rock artist, newly minted, was basically implied to need to do. So, out of it, you get this kind of explosion of bands. First, obviously, bands like Pink Floyd and Procol Harum and all of that. And then by the late 60s and in the early 70s, obviously, like the first wave of kind of progressive rock bands, as we know them, ELP and so forth. But I then kind of mapped that same trajectory across decades, sort of looking at how that same propensity for progress, which by the way, it's worth saying, I did musicological analysis, and you can actually kind of find a lot of the same principles appearing in the music. Kind of just looked at how that correlated to each of the further waves of prog, like neo-prog in the 80s, kind of contemporary progressive metal in the 90s and onwards. Yeah, so you know, it's always a bit boring talking about a PhD, but I had a lot of fun doing it. I still love the project.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've released your debut single called Flicker,
Mm.
but state that you will not immediately, well, it won't be followed by a solo album. I know you're working on a new Caligula's Horse album. Why the need to get
Yeah.
this single out?
Well, so basically, let me take a step back, I suppose. 2020, we released Rise Radiant with Caligula's Horse, and that was kind of this fairly significant moment for us, not just in terms of releasing an album, it's always a significant moment, but you know, we had a huge headline tour booked in the US and all of our kind of European and stuff dates. You know, after that, we were basically kind of staring down the barrel of what we thought was going to be this straight up like next level shift in our career. And then, of course, COVID hit and everything stopped, and we went into kind of this you know, stasis for the following kind of, well, basically 2 years. So we were in this weird position where we didn't really want to start writing the next record for Caligula's Horse, because it would almost be this admission that Rise Radiant is done with. You know, we never actually got to do the things you do with a record. You get to know the songs on the road and all of that kind of stuff. So we sort of just took something of a sabbatical. You know, we kept working on all of our Caligula's Horse media and stuff in the meantime, but I just went and sort of wrote some music that didn't necessarily align with that. Used it as basically an explicit experimental kind of phase. You know, what can I create that could then perhaps have some purchase in Caligula's Horse later, or what can I learn from it, right? And I wrote quite a bit of music in that period, but you know, most of it was in kind of bits, not necessarily arranged in full. And of course, the call eventually came to you know, start heading towards the next album deadlines for Caligula's Horse, which, you know, I tend to be the kind of the nexus for all of that writing. You know, it sort of starts with me. So I basically had to, within a fairly short time, kind of shelve a lot of that stuff. So that's to say, like, you know, there was definitely an EP or an album kind of in the makings, but the only song that was far enough in terms of its development was Flicker. So I ended up deciding, well, you know, I'll release it. I'll use it as a means of just kind of establishing, I suppose, that, you know, something else can happen here in the future. But of course, in the press release, we're pretty explicit about saying, you know, like, it's not going to have an album immediately, just in case, you know, that's kind of misinterpreted. So basically, after the next Caligula's Horse record, it's my intention to follow up on that fully.
Yeah. So how did you arrive at the title, Flicker?
I really struggled with the title for this because, you know, it's a 6.5-minute strange instrumental tune with a lot of really kind of weird rhythmic stuff and whatnot. My working title was Dancing Lights, just because visually that's kind of what I liked. But the problem is you could read it also as dancing lights, you know, like lights for dancing, and I didn't really like that very much. So Flicker seemed to capture some of that same energy and kind of, you know, visual, I suppose. So yeah, nothing special beyond that, I guess.
Did you spend an inordinate amount of time on it? Was it hard to let it go?
Yeah, I spent ages on it. I mean, the thing is, for the last, you know, well, really the last decade, I've kind of written music in the context of, you know, lyric and melody. You know, obviously with a vocalist, where you kind of you get certain things for free, especially when you've got an awesome singer like I do in Jim, where, you know, you can write melodies that are really good, but the moment they're attached to lyrics, they become even better. Whereas, you know, writing something like this, especially after spending, you know, 10 years mostly working in the other side of that world, it can be really hard to make a melody feel meaningful when, you know, it's just played on my little humble guitar. So I ended up kind of well, I guess I struggled with that quite a bit. You know, I had to kind of make sure that everything felt like not only was it interesting and compelling, but there was a sense of contrast that actually justified listening to 6 minutes of guitar playing. And whether I've done that or not, I'm not really sure, but that was kind of the intention behind it. So yeah, I mean, you know, I'm always someone who spends probably a little too long kind of trying every version of you know, of a song that I'm working on. But I think Flicker was that turned up a few degrees.
What about the gear that you used in the recording of the single, and did it differ in what you would use for Caligula's Horse?
It actually did a little bit. The thing is, with Caligula's Horse, you know, we obviously have kind of the budget and everything behind it to kind of do mostly what we want. And for the most part, I still tend to default to a lot of the gear that I know. I'm very much like a digital devotee as of the last probably, I don't know, better part of a decade. I was a valve amp maniac when I was younger, but I've slowly been kind of converted to the other side. But Flickr was, much like it was an experimental kind of compositional process, it was also a chance for me to really try out a lot of kind of the new technology that I've been working with. So the track is exclusively done with Neural DSP stuff. It's a company I've been working with for a couple of years now, mostly plugins, but I got a little kind of floorboard unit from them about halfway through the recording. So that's, all of the guitar tones were kind of made purely in the digital realm, and I kind of love that because I'm really happy with them. But it really is just a chance for me to say, like, is this going to be something that I can do going ahead? And the answer was a resounding yes, in my opinion. In terms of guitars, same guitars as Caligula's Horse. However, I did get that guitar you can see in the background there, that Music Man Cutlass, which is like a single coil guitar, like a Strat, which is used all throughout, which hasn't actually featured on a Caligula's Horse record, but it will in the future. Other than that, it's just my regular kind of Music Man JP7, JP15, and a couple of other instruments that I have floating about.
Yeah. What about the fabulous cover art for the single? Was that you as well? Are you an artist?
I am very fortunate to have a bunch of much better artists than I who I can call upon for things like that. So that was actually Chris Stevenson Mangos, who is an artist who we've worked with in the Caligula's Horse context in a bunch of different settings. So he did the cover art for Bloom. He also did the cover art for Rise Radiant. But he's also just done like a lot of kind of layout designs and things for us. And basically, you can sort of see this very like hastily put together kind of single that I just wanted to get out there. I hit up Chris and just said, hey, I've got all these ideas. Here's a spew of concepts. And he gave me that wonderful image after a couple of revisions, which I just love. So yeah, Chris Mangos, incredible artist.
Yeah. So looking to the future, when you do release an album and get to play your own material, have you thought about what your band setup would look like?
That is a very good question. I have thought about it a little bit because I've already kind of had a couple of discussions with some other guitar kind of figures, friends who I sort of talk shop with all the time. Basically, like, to take it on tour is something that I very much want to do, and I'm sure I will. I think Josh is probably going to be on drums. Josh is Caligula's Horse's drummer. He also did the drums on Flickr, and he's kind of my go-to as a producer. I hire him as a session drummer all of the time as well. He's just awesome, and helps that he's one of the best people I know. But other than that, it's kind of tricky. I mean, bass, rhythm guitar. I mean, there's a lot of keyboards as well. I'll probably cheap out and put a lot of it on backing tracks. I don't know. It depends how much of that I can stand, really. But I'm not sure. Suffice to say, I definitely want to do it. It'll just be a matter of working out the logistics.
Yeah. So when you look back at Caligula Horse's career, what are your strongest memories?
There's definitely a few. I mean, some of them kind of melancholy, and some of them, really quite beautiful. I remember the first time we toured Europe, 2015. We had this bizarre kind of set of circumstances throughout the tour where it was kind of like the world was just falling down around us. Like when we were in Italy, we got stuck in the middle of this horrible kind of like far right race riot. Like, just our bus just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Things like that kind of happened. But what was really kind of momentous was, you remember the Bataclan shooting that happened that year? The Eagles of Death Metal concert, I believe. A bunch of people were shot there. We played in Paris 2 days after that, like, just by sheer circumstance. And the whole lead up to that was like, we obviously didn't know whether we should or could even kind of get into the city at the time. Obviously, they were in a state of emergency. We ended up kind of, driving into this bizarrely quiet Paris, as you can probably imagine. And we had all of the bands on the tour would all kind of, put out messages saying, don't come to this gig if you feel at all unsafe, if you feel like it's, even in bad taste or anything like that, we're here because we think it's important for us to be here. But at the same time, it's totally up to you whether you agree with us there. We end up selling out this venue and just having this incredible kind of almost hometown show feel to it. Someone had bought like what were they, like glow sticks, and there was just this incredible sense that, obviously Paris is the city that is basically defined by its history of art. And there was this kind of almost rebellious show of like, you know, we're here to do this, even though there's been a horrible tragedy, you know, only recently in a similar setting. So I remember kind of, again, not even knowing if that was the thing we should have been doing. By the end of that night, I was sure we'd chosen correctly. So that's definitely one that stands out to me. It was an incredible gig and an incredible experience in general, especially talking to people who had faced that tragedy head first in a lot of cases. So yeah, I mean, a bit of a melancholic one, I'm sorry, but an incredibly memorable moment in our career.
Yeah. So what can you tell us about the next album?
The next Caligula's Horse album. Well, it's definitely thematically a little darker. It's kind of an expression, I suppose, of, you know, the fact that we really have been, well, one, stuck at home for a couple of years, you know, kind of trying to come to terms with who we are as a band and artists when the main thrust of what we do has been taken from us, you know, in that time. And obviously I say that with the kind of recognition that every artist has experienced this over the last couple of years, and many people have experienced far worse, you know, throughout this pandemic period. But nonetheless, it's a reflection of, you know, some stuff that is reasonably dark in terms of coming to terms with who we are and, you know, what makes us do this, even in the face of things that for a lot of bands have meant the end of their run. I mean, you know, we saw lots of bands break up throughout the pandemic for similar reasons. But as with all Caligula's Horse stuff, we don't tend to dwell on the darkness, you know. So there's a sense of this being a kind of catharsis, I suppose. Like, you know, we're still here. We still think what we do has some kind of relevance, and we still think that it's plugged into something that is kind of bigger than just, you know, playing a couple of shows or whatever else. And, you know, as a result, it's a little bit less riffy, a little bit more kind of broad and spacious and kind of conceptual, I suppose you could say. Yeah, well, hopefully we finish it by the end of the year or thereabouts. Should be out sometime, hopefully sometime next year. It just depends on how long the label needs to get it out.
Yeah. Okay, well, for the time being, your debut single Flicker is out and about, a taste of things to come. Sam Vallen, it's been great to chat.
Great to chat to you, Greg. Thank you.